He died at noon, and again at dusk. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Let me know where in the world are you listening from today. I love hearing from every one of you. On the morning of the St. Mildred's Garden Society's annual spring showcase, the village of Little Witham was abuzz with its peculiar kind of excitement. That is to say, quiet nods in the post office queue, slightly more animated than usual chatter over cuttings and compost, and the occasional low-toned squabble about whose clematis had overrun whose fence. The sun broke gently through the lingering clouds, warming the thatched rooftops and coaxing bees from their hives in sluggish, honey-heavy spirals. At precisely 11 o'clock the gate of Fairview Cottage opened, and Miss Jane Marple emerged with a basket of yellow roses, snipped that morning from her modest but orderly garden. She wore a soft grey cardigan, white gloves and a hat adorned with a faded ribbon she had intended to replace since 1952. But Miss Marple did not replace things lightly, especially when they served. Across the green bunting fluttered above the churchyard wall, and folding chairs had already begun their slow migration toward the tea tents. Children darted about, forbidden from touching the exhibits, which ensured they touched nearly all of them. It was, in short, a day like many others in Little Witham, until the scream. It came from the direction of the tool shed behind the vicarage, sharp and sudden, slicing through the chatter like shears through silk. The effect was immediate. Heads turned, a tea tray clattered to the grass, and several members of the committee began briskly walking, not quite running, for that would have been unseemly, toward the source of the sound. Miss Marple, who had paused only to set her basket gently on a bench, was among the first to arrive. The small group gathered outside the wooden shed where Mrs. Pendlebury, the vicar's housekeeper, stood pale and trembling, her apron askew and her hand pressed to her mouth. "Inside," she whispered hoarsely. "There's someone inside." The vicar, Reverend Ambrose Draycott, a thin and soft-spoken man of 60, stepped forward and hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open. What they saw made even the more stoic villagers gasp. Slumped in an awkward heap against the wall, amid a scatter of gardening tools, lay the body of a man. His neck was at a cruel angle, and one hand still clutched a faded leather note. A few feet away, an overturned stool suggested a fall, though the man's formal suit and polished shoes made his presence in the shed all the more incongruous. "He's dead," said the vicar faintly, looking down at the body. "Good Lord, that's Mr. Harold Tapping." A murmur passed through the crowd. Mr. Tapping was a solicitor from Market Lorimer, a town some 10 miles distant, hardly a local, but known well enough from his visits on various legal errands. Always rather precise, always in a waistcoat, and never, it was said, seen smiling. "But that's not possible," exclaimed Mrs. Reeves, the baker's wife. Her round face flushed. "I saw Mr. Tapping this morning, at 9 sharp, walking past the post office. I said good morning to him and he nodded, plain as day." "You must have been mistaken," someone else muttered. "I was not mistaken, Mr. Ludlow," she said sharply. "I know a man when I see one, and I saw Harold Tapping, alive, today." Miss Marple, who had said nothing so far, tilted her head slightly and stepped forward. She looked not at the body, but at the ground near the door, at the irregular footprints in the dirt at the stool's legs, and the streak of what appeared to be oil or boot polish on the shed's threshold. The local constable, young Sergeant Forbes, soon arrived, perspiring and over-earnest, and began cordoning off the scene with string borrowed from the bunting boxes. "Right. No one's to enter or touch anything. We'll be waiting for the inspector from Bracknell." "But I saw him this morning," Mrs. Reeves insisted again, as if sheer repetition could force the world to realign with her memory. "He was alive." Miss Marple turned to her, voice mild but firm. "Mrs. Reeves, forgive me. Did he greet you?" "No. Just nodded." "He looked in a hurry." Miss Marple nodded to herself and looked once more at the shed, where the body of Harold Tapping lay still as stone. "Curious," she said softly. "Most curious because while many things could happen on the morning of a garden show, a thunderstorm, a lost corsage, a spat over jam categories, it was rare, even in Little Witham, for a man to die once in the tool shed and once more in full view of the post office." And Jane Marple, who knew a great deal about geraniums, murder and the deceitful habits of seemingly respectable men, had already begun to wonder, what if both sightings were true? The discovery of Harold Tapping's body cast a long wavering shadow over what ought to have been the most pleasant day in Little Witham's spring calendar. The garden exhibits were left unattended, half-sliced sponge cakes and untouched cups of tea abandoned beneath the fluttering bunting. People gathered in cautious huddles, their voices lowered, though their eyes gleamed with the unmistakable light of gossip, sharpened now by fear. Miss Marple returned to her bench beside the roses, and sat quietly, hands folded over her handbag. She appeared the very model of English propriety, a sweet elderly lady, enjoying the warmth of the day despite the grim proceedings just yards away. But her eyes did not rest. They moved subtly from face to face, noting gestures, glances, inconsistencies. Reeves, still breathless from her insistence that she had seen Mr. Tapping that morning, was now recounting the event to her husband in great detail. He had that same old briefcase, the one with the scuff near the latch, and his umbrella. I remember because I thought, why an umbrella on a day like this? It's not the sort of thing you imagine, is it? Seeing a dead man. Mr. Reeves nodded solemnly, though his expression hovered between concern and exasperation. He had the air of a man who wished his wife had noticed a little less, and talked about it much less. Over by the trestle tables, Reverend Draycott was speaking in low tones with Sergeant Forbes. The young constable was trying, with limited success, to impose order on the scene. "Sir," he was saying, "we'll need to take statements, of course, and I'll be asking folks not to leave the grounds just yet, until the inspector arrives." Quite right," the vicar said distractedly, casting a glance toward the shed. "Though it's the most confounding thing. Mr. Tapping came to see me only yesterday. He wanted to discuss the late Mrs. Burling's will. Routine business. I never expected, well, certainly not this. And he gave no indication of trouble, no mention of being threatened, or anyone he had concerns about. No, none. Though he did seem," Draycott paused, frowning, "not nervous, exactly, but distracted. He asked more than once if anyone else had come by asking about the Burling matter. I told him no, which was true." Sergeant Forbes made a few brisk notes. He was trying to look competent, but the notebook trembled slightly in his hand. Meanwhile, Miss Marple rose as though only just now deciding it was time for tea. She moved with her usual careful grace, pausing by the edge of the garden where a clump of delphiniums drooped politely in the breeze. There she happened upon Miss Lavinia Blake, the church organist, who was kneeling to retrieve a dropped glove. A stout spinster with sharp shoulders and a habit of making pointed remarks with feigned innocence. Miss Blake looked up sharply. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said with strained brightness, "what a dreadful turn the day has taken. Imagine, a solicitor, no less. One never thinks of such people being well killed." "I don't believe we're certain it was murder," Miss Marple replied lightly, "though I suppose it's always safest to prepare for the worst." Miss Blake gave a tight little laugh. "He always struck me as a man of secret, so meticulous, so very careful. You can usually tell with men like that, can one?" Miss Marple asked, mildly. Miss Blake's smile faltered. "I simply mean he was the sort to hide things. Private, secretive. If you want my opinion, he was probably up to something improper." "You may well be right," Miss Marple said with a soft sigh. "The trouble is, of course, that improper things are often hidden very carefully, especially in villages like ours." She turned back toward the tea table, now abandoned save for a single slow wilting sandwich, but her path was interrupted again, this time by the arrival of Dr. Hale, summoned as a matter of protocol despite the obvious finality of Mr. Tapping's condition. The doctor, a kindly rumpled man in his 60s, emerged from the tool shed, wiping his spectacles with the edge of his sleeve. He looked tired, irritated, and faintly puzzled. "Neck's broken, quite cleanly," he muttered to Forbes. "But the angle, it's odd, almost as though he was placed that way. Not a typical fall, not from a stool that low, unless he struck something hard and sharp, but nothing of the sort is visible." "Are you saying it wasn't an accident then?" asked the sergeant. "I'm saying," said Hale, replacing his spectacles and squinting at the shed, "that I wouldn't rule out foul play. He's been dead for some hours, at any rate. I'd put the time well before 9 this morning." This last statement rippled through the crowd like a thrown stone. Miss Reeves let out a gasp, loud enough to startle a nearby robin. "But," she began, only to falter as heads turned toward her. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. Miss Reeves, I wonder if you might humor an old woman and describe exactly what you saw this morning." "Well, I already said," she stammered. "It was just past 9. I'd gone out to sweep the front step, and I saw Mr. Tapping walking up the lane past the post office. Gray suit, briefcase. He didn't speak, just nodded, and moved on. Did you see his face? Well, at least I thought I did. Sometimes we think we've seen more than we have, Miss Marple said kindly, especially when we expect to see a particular person, familiar gait, familiar coat. It's so easy to let our eyes finish the picture, even when the truth is a little different. Miss Reeves bristled. Are you saying I imagined it? Oh no, not imagined, but possibly mistaken. The murmuring swelled again. A few villagers began glancing at one another with new, uneasy suspicion. The implication was dawning. If Harold Tapping had been dead since early morning, then someone local had gone to considerable trouble to impersonate him. And why? Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the ground once more. The grass outside the shed was slightly trampled. The footprints varied in size and direction. One set, she noted, led away from the shed, and around the side of the vicarage, toward the rear entrance where few would have passed. And something else, a faint line in the dirt as if a heavy object had been dragged. Perhaps not a body, but a briefcase. Later, as Inspector Cray from Bracknell arrived and began his brisk, no-nonsense questioning, Miss Marple remained a quiet observer. She offered her statement with her usual calm precision, making no more of it than necessary. But in her mind, the pieces had begun to stir. Someone had gone to great lengths to delay the discovery of Harold Tapping's body. Someone had wanted the world to believe he was alive at 9 o'clock, when he most certainly was not. Someone in the village or very near to it had worn his clothes, carried his briefcase, and mimicked his quiet, unsmiling walk, just convincingly enough to pass. Not to fool everyone, of course, just enough people, just long enough. That sort of impersonation took preparation, and boldness, and a motive. Miss Marple looked toward the crowd. Already, faces were returning to their routines, albeit with a nervous glance here and there. Tea was once again being poured. Someone had begun slicing the Victoria sponge, as though to deny the horror with civility, but death had settled over Little Witham, and for those who looked closely, it had not arrived without rehearsal. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Yes, she murmured, I think this is going to be a rather unusual case. The following morning dawned with a sky the color of faded pewter and a fine mist that blurred the hedgerows and softened the distant chimneys of Little Witham. Yet despite the dreary weather, the village itself was alight with a quiet fervor, an invisible crackle that ran beneath the surface of daily life. It was not every day, after all, that one awoke to find a murder investigation on one's village green and the specter of a man who had somehow managed to die twice. By 8 o'clock the windows of the post office were steamed from within, and a small but steady stream of villagers came in under various pretenses. Some needed stamps, others claimed to need the latest issue of The Lady, and a few most audaciously simply wanted to know whether poor Miss Kelsey had any updates, as if she were running a live news broadcast from behind her modest counter. Miss Marple, as was her custom, took her breakfast early and unhurriedly. She had no need for stamps, nor magazines that morning. She had instead a small invitation in mind, one that would open a door far more revealing than any newspaper ever could. By 9:30 she had made her way to Orchard House, a modest but well-kept dwelling on the northern edge of the village. It belonged to Miss Cicely Goffer, a widow of considerable energy and a sharp tongue. Cicely had once been engaged to a captain in the Royal Engineers, though he'd perished tragically in the Sudan. She had since devoted herself to community committees, quiet gardening, and the passionate dislike of anyone who failed to return borrowed jam jars. Miss Marple, ever diplomatic, had made a quiet study of Miss Goffer's conversational habits over the years, and knew precisely how to draw her out. A simple line about such terrible business at the garden show was all it took. Terrible, Miss Goffer exclaimed, showing Miss Marple into her front room, where the hearth glowed, and a needlepoint project lay abandoned on a footstool. It's scandalous, Jane. Absolutely scandalous. To think someone could be killed, and right here in the heart of Little Witham. Why, it could be anyone. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, settling into a chintz armchair. And so strange too. I believe you knew Mr. Tapping, did you not? Knew of him, certain. He was the sort of man one avoids lingering with in conversation, dull as boiled cabbage, and about as warm. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And yet it seems he was embroiled in something, well, something unseemly. Do you suppose it had anything to do with the Burling estate? Miss Goffer raised an eyebrow. Oh, that old nonsense.
Everyone knows there's a disagreement over it. Old Mrs. Burling left everything to her niece, Esther. You remember the plain girl who married that awful man from Cheltenham? Miss Marple nodded. And not to the son. There was no son, Miss Goffer corrected crisply. Not officially. There was gossip years ago, something about a child from before her marriage. But if there was such a child, no one ever came forward. And Mr. Tapping, I understand, had the unenviable task of handling it all. Do you think anyone would have resented his decisions? My dear, when it comes to money, people will resent you for anything. But the strange thing is, I saw him too, on the morning of the garden show, at the station. I swear it. Miss Marple's brows lifted. The station? Yes. Just before 8. I was collecting a package new curtain fabric from Guildford. He was on the opposite platform, looking ever so peculiar. Didn't seem to see me at all. That's very interesting, Miss Marple murmured, eyes narrowing just slightly. Very interesting indeed. She took her leave soon after, politely declining a second cup of tea and making her way back through the mist-laced village with a sense of momentum beginning to form behind her thoughts. If Harold Tapping had been seen near the station just before 8, and again outside the post office just after 9, by people with no reason to lie, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it appear he was alive hours after his probable time of death. What was the purpose of such deception? Delay, certainly, but for what end? To allow something to be taken, planted. Miss Marple considered the facts in her usual precise manner, as she paused outside the iron gate of the vicar. It stood open now, with the garden a little less tidy than usual, as though shocked by the previous day's events. Sergeant Forbes was inside, speaking with the vicar again. From the window, Miss Marple could hear the younger man's voice, more assertive than before, as though trying to impress his superior officers with newly discovered competence. I've examined the grounds, sir, he said, and there's no sign of forced entry, nothing taken. But the briefcase is missing. That's certain, the one Mr. Tapping always carried. That's troubling, Reverend Draycott replied. He had it with him when I saw him yesterday afternoon, placed it right on that table. Could it have contained the... That's the theory we're following, Forbes said, and if so, then someone may have murdered him for it. Miss Marple knocked gently, and was soon admitted. She declined a chair this time, and went instead to the window that overlooked the path behind the garden. There's something I wondered about, she said delicately. You mentioned Mr. Tapping was here about the will. Did he give any indication that the document had been challenged? Not in so many words, said the vicar, but he did seem well anxious. Asked if any old letters had ever surfaced, particularly from the late Mrs. Burling's youth. Miss Marple inclined her head. Letters? Yes, he said. Now that I recall it, old things have a way of reappearing in inconvenient moments. I assumed he meant family quarrel. Perhaps he did, said Miss Marple, eyes glinting. But that phrase, it rather sounds like someone worried about blackmail, doesn't it? That suggestion lingered in the air, and even the vicar looked faintly startled by it. Miss Marple took her leave once again, this time heading toward the edge of the village. There was one more stop she intended to make before lunch.
She found young Michael Lawton pacing behind the village hall, his boots leaving damp tracks in the gravel. A tall, awkward youth of perhaps 21, Michael worked at the estate agency in Bracknell, but still lived with his widowed mother on Church Lane. He had always been polite, deferential even, toward Miss Marple, though she suspected it came more from fear than affection. Miss Marple, he said, startled. I didn't expect. I was just taking the air, she said. It's a habit that serves both the lungs and the mind. May I walk with you? He nodded stiffly, and they paced in silence for a few moments. You knew Mr. Tapping, didn't you? She asked. Michael hesitated. Only a bit. He came to our office now and then, asked about properties, empty cottages, that sort of thing. Did he now? And recently? Michael nodded. About a fortnight ago. Wanted to know if any unoccupied cottages had mail forwarding, said it was a legal matter. Curious, said Miss Marple gently. Most people ask about the roof or the plumbing. Michael gave a nervous smile. He was odd. I got the sense he was looking for someone, or maybe watching for them. They paused, watching the mist lift slowly from the trees beyond. Miss Marple turned to him, voice soft. Michael, forgive me, but were you at the garden show yesterday morning? He flushed slightly. No, I wasn't feeling well. Stayed in, and yet. Miss Marple said, tilting her head. I believe your boots match those prints near the shed. Michael blanched. I wasn't. She touched his arm lightly. No need to say anything now. But if you saw something, anything, it might help keep someone innocent from being blamed. Michael looked away, throat working, but said nothing. Miss Marple nodded kindly and turned back toward the village. The briefcase was missing. A forged sighting had bought someone time. Old letters, possibly damaging ones, were being quietly hunted. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a young man was holding onto a secret. Yes, it was unfolding now, and Jane Marple, with her blue eyes deceptively kind and her mind sharp as a stiletto, had begun to feel the shape of something underneath the fog. Not the solution, not yet. But the pattern had begun to show through. By the next day the mist had lifted from Little Witham, but the sense of unease had not. The villagers went about their business with a kind of cautious civility, as though afraid that any careless word might be twisted into suspicion. Children were kept closer to home, dogs were walked on shorter leashes, and even the most enthusiastic gardeners paused before opening their sheds. Miss Marple, however, remained as tranquil as ever. After morning tea and a light breakfast of toast and quince jelly, she put on her glove, chose a sensible straw hat, and set off toward the high street, not to visit the grocer or the post office, though she waved pleasantly to both, but rather to call on Esther Burling, the woman who had, rather unintentionally, become one of the more quietly discussed people in the village since the day of the garden show. Esther lived in a modest but attractive stone cottage set back from the road, its front garden brimming with nasturtiums, foxglove, and one slightly wayward camellia. Miss Marple noticed as she approached that a curtain fluttered back into place just before the door opened. Esther was already watching. That told Miss Marple quite a bit. Miss Marple, Esther said with a tight smile. How kind. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever is, Miss Marple replied gently, but I thought under the circumstances you might appreciate the company of another woman. Esther hesitated, then stepped back to allow her guest inside. The interior of the cottage was simple but well arranged, with tasteful furnishings and a faint smell of lavender polish. Esther herself was a woman in her late 30s, with pale brown hair drawn into a neat chignon, and a face that had once been called handsome, if not beautiful. It was a face that now looked drawn, as though sleep had become something she only read about in books. I imagine you've had rather a trying week, Miss Marple said as they settled in the front sitting room. The police must have questioned you at some length. Esther nodded, twisting her fingers in her lap. They asked about the will mostly, about Harold. I suppose that makes sense, though I didn't expect to be involved. You were the chief beneficiary, weren't you? Yes. Aunt Millicent left everything to me. The house, the estate. I didn't ask for it, Miss Marple. I was surprised by it, truly. Miss Marple's voice was mild. That must have caused resentment. Esther looked up quickly. You think someone killed Harold over it? I think someone went to a great deal of trouble to make his death appear to have happened at a very specific time, and one usually only rearranges facts when the truth is inconvenient. Esther's gaze dropped again. She took a moment, then said quietly, there were rumors years ago that Aunt Millicent had another child before she married, a boy, illegitimate. She never admitted anything of the kind, of course, and no one ever came forward. But you believe she did? Esther nodded. She once slipped, called me by a different name, Helen, then went quite pale. I asked her about it later and she snapped that I must have misheard, but I hadn't. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, saying nothing for a moment. Did Harold Tapping ever speak to you about this? No, not directly, but he visited more than once after the funeral, and each time he seemed more tense, on edge, as though something had changed. The last time I saw him just 2 days before he died, he asked me if I'd ever gone through Aunt Millicent's papers, suggested I might find something enlightening. What did you find? Esther hesitated. Nothing, or rather, nothing I understood. Some letters written in another hand, just initials. P.W. They were affectionate, but vague. I couldn't make sense of them. There were gaps, torn pages. Did you keep them? I burned them, Esther said suddenly. I didn't want to be involved in any scandal. I've had quite enough judgment from this village without adding illegitimacy and secrets to the list. Miss Marple regarded her calmly. Even so, Harold believed they were important. Yes, Esther admitted, and now he's dead. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Esther followed her to the door and asked softly,
Do you believe someone will be arrested soon? I believe, Miss Marple said, that someone has already begun to feel the walls closing in. People often act rashly when they realize their plan has begun to unravel. On her way home, Miss Marple detoured slightly, stopping by the village green where she found Inspector Cray, speaking with Sergeant Forbes near the tea pavilion. Cray was a solidly built man with graying hair and a manner more used to urban crimes than rural subtlety. He greeted Miss Marple with polite deference, having already learned not to underestimate her. Miss Marple, he said, still poking about. Just observing, she replied pleasantly. Though I did wonder, have you found the briefcase yet? No, Cray admitted. We've searched the shed, the vicarage, even the hedgerows. It's gone, and it's beginning to look like the only thing actually missing from this whole sordid business. It may not be far, Miss Marple said. People rarely hide things as well as they imagine. Do you have a theory? I have a hunch, she corrected gently, based on a phrase Harold Tapping used. Old things have a way of reappearing in inconvenient moments. It strikes me that perhaps this entire affair isn't about the will at all. Perhaps it's about something old, something buried. Cray gave her a wary look. You think this isn't about inheritance? I think, Miss Marple said, that whoever impersonated Mr. Tapping on the morning of the garden show wasn't trying to steal the Burling fortune. They were trying to delay the discovery of the body long enough to retrieve something from the briefcase. Cray considered this. Then we need to know what was in it. Indeed, she said. And I believe the answer may lie with young Michael Lawton. Cray raised a brow. The estate agent's assistant, Forbes, mentioned he was behaving oddly. He was more than odd, Miss Marple said. He was frightened. I believe he saw something that morning, perhaps even who moved the body. Cray looked thoughtful. You'd better leave that to me, Miss Marple. I always do, she said with a faint smile. That evening, as the village settled into its quiet routines once more, a small group of children discovered something unusual near the footpath behind the vicarage. Wedged beneath a loose stone in the garden wall, wrapped in oilskin and secured with string, was a worn brown briefcase. Inside, a jumble of documents, several letters signed only P.W., and a faded birth certificate. The child's name Peter Wilmot, mother Millicent Burling. Miss Marple sat in her parlor that night, knitting slowly, her thoughts weaving faster than her needles. The truth was coming closer, not with the roar of revelation, but with the quiet rustle of connections made, and deceptions unraveled. Harold Tapping had known, someone else had too, and someone had killed to keep it hidden. But in Little Witham, secrets were like weeds. They might hide beneath the soil for a time, but eventually they blew. The next morning Miss Marple found herself awakened not by the chiming of her bedside clock, but by the sound of raised voices just beyond her garden gate. She drew back her bedroom curtain to see Sergeant Forbes in hurried conversation with Michael Lawton, whose posture was hunched and defensive, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. The boy looked as though he'd spent the night battling more than cold. She dressed promptly and stepped outside just as the two were finishing their conversation. Michael gave her a startled glance, and mumbled something unintelligible before walking away at a clip. Sergeant Forbes remained behind, fiddling with his note. Good morning, Miss Marple, he said, trying for casualness. You're up early. One tends to wake early when something's troubling the conscience, she said mildly. Is Mr. Lawton in trouble? Forbes looked uncomfortable. Inspector Cray asked me to speak to him again. We've recovered the briefcase, thanks to those children, and Cray suspects Lawton may know more than he's let on. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. Michael is not a dishonest boy by nature, but he is impressionable and frightened. I imagine what he saw or believes he saw doesn't align with what he's being told. Forbes hesitated. You think he saw the killer? I think, she replied, he saw someone moving the body, and perhaps impersonating Harold Tapping, and he's been made to feel that saying so would bring him trouble. Forbes closed his notebook. I'll tell the inspector. But Miss Marple doubted Cray would listen to anyone except the law or the law. He was methodical, not unkind, but he trusted the tangible over the intuitive, which is why she felt it necessary to continue her own inquiries while the police pursued missing wills and forged identities. After a brief stop for tea, she made her way to the far end of the village, where the Willits family kept a modest allotment, and an overly friendly goat. Eliza Willits, the youngest daughter, had once worked as a cleaner for the late Mrs. Burling. She had the kind of memory that stored details no one asked for, and a tendency to talk as though she were afraid the silence might catch her unprepared. "Eliza," Miss Marple began after the usual pleasantries, "you worked for Mrs. Burling for many years, didn't you?" "Oh yes," Eliza said proudly. "Every Tuesday and Friday morning. She was very particular, you know, wouldn't let me move a single ornament without gloves, even had labels on the underside, said where they ought to be returned." "And did you ever come across personal paper, letters, perhaps, things that didn't quite belong?" Eliza looked around, lowered her voice. "Well, once. There was a little tin box hidden at the back of the linen cupboard. I dusted it only once. She caught me, and gave me such a look, said it was not my business, that's what she said. I left it after that." "And Harold Tapping, did you ever see him with it?" "No, but he came after she died, didn't he? Said he was the executor, and needed to go through everything. I let him in one morning, then went out to weed the back garden. When I came in he was pale and sweating, and the tin box was gone." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The timeline was beginning to take shape. Harold Tapping had discovered something in that box, something to do with Peter Wilmot, a secret illegitimate child, one never publicly acknowledged, but whose existence had threatened to undo the careful balance of inheritance and reputation. And yet, that wasn't quite enough to explain the impersonation. By late afternoon, news had spread across the village. Michael Lawton had been taken in for formal questioning. The reactions were mixed. Some, like Mrs. Reeves, seemed vindicated by the boy's nervous behavior. "I said he was too quiet, and always listening. You can tell with that sort, always listening, but never speaking, as if he's planning something." Others, like Reverend Draycott, appeared troubled. "He's a good boy, lost his father young, helps his mother. It's hard to believe he'd be mixed up in anything like this." Miss Marple said very little. Instead, she walked the slow loop of the village green, retracing steps in her mind rather than on the gravel. If Michael had seen something, had possibly even helped someone under pressure, it still didn't fit that he would have a motive to kill Harold Tapping. No, someone else had orchestrated this, and they had done so with the kind of precision born from knowing both the victim and the landscape intimately. That evening, she attended evensong at St. Mildred's as she often. The pews were less full than usual, but quiet worship always suited Miss Marple more than crowded services, and as she listened to Reverend Draycott speak gently of conscience and confession, her mind wandered toward another kind of confession altogether. The service concluded, and the organ notes faded into stillness. She lingered a moment at the rear, until she was alone with the vicar. "Reverend Draycott," she said softly, "I wonder if I might ask something a little delicate." He turned, surprised but not displeased. "Of course, Miss Marple. When Mr. Tapping visited you the day before his death, you said he asked about old letters. Did he happen to leave anything with you?" The vicar hesitated. Miss Marple gave him a reassuring look. "I ask not to pry, but to prevent further tragedy. I believe he feared for his safety." Draycott reached into the folds of his robe, and produced a sealed envelope, worn at the corners. "He asked me to keep it in case of untimely misfortune. I was to give it to the authorities if anything happened to him, but I hesitated. You see, I thought perhaps I was overreacting." She took the envelope gently. "It's not overreacting. It's prudent. Thank you." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple opened the letter with care. Inside, a single sheet, written in Harold Tapping's stiff, upright hand. "If anything happens to me, the truth must be known. Peter Wilmot is the biological son of Millicent Burling. I have kept this knowledge confidential for decades. Recently, I received a letter from someone claiming to be Wilmot himself, demanding documents and a share of the estate. I feared blackmail. I arranged to meet him in Little Witham. If I do not survive that meeting, he must be held responsible." Below, an address scrawled in haste. "The Crown Inn, Bracknell, Room 3, Thursday night." Miss Marple leaned back, fingers steepled, the knitting forgotten beside her. Harold had met someone the night before he died, someone pretending to be Peter Wilmot, but that person had not come forward. Why? Because they weren't Peter at all, and they had worn his clothes, carried his case, walked past the post office at 9. There was only one person in the village with the physical resemblance, the motive, and the access to Harold's schedule. She reached for the phone, and dialed slowly. "Inspector Cray, please." "Yes, tell him, Miss Marple is calling, and I believe I know who killed Harold Tapping." She paused, then added gently, "and why he needed to die twice. He stepped out with the brisk efficiency of a man who had spent the better part of his career among thieves, swindlers, and the occasional high-strung murderess. Yet as he approached us,
Miss Marple reached into her handbag and drew out a small envelope. I believe Harold Tapping intended for you to have this. Inside was a single folded sheet. Harold's final, unsigned addendum to the will. It granted Esther full stewardship of the estate, on one condition, that she fund a local trust in Peter Wilmot's name, a gesture perhaps toward restoring a dignity long denied. Esther read it in silence, her fingers trembling slightly. I don't deserve this, she whispered. No one ever does, Miss Marple said. But you can still do good with it. As she left Rosewood Cottage, Miss Marple found herself walking without urgency, her steps drifting toward the green. The weather had turned again, sunlight streaking through high clouds, the breeze playful but not unkind. She paused at the bench near the church gate and watched the village as it quietly stitched itself back together. Children passed on bicycles, wobbling through puddles. Miss Ludlow, the apiarist, waved to her from behind his honey stand. Somewhere in the distance the train gave a long, low sigh. And still something gnawed. She retrieved her notebook, not the kind she used for shopping lists, but the other, more discreet one, kept tucked into the lining of her handbag. It contained no names, only patterns, and as she flipped to the most recent page, she saw it again, a small, persistent question. Why digitox? Reverend Draycott had confessed to using it. Poisoned tea, he had said, brewed in a hotel pot before the fatal conversation. And digitoxin derived from foxglove was effective, but it was also notoriously slow-acting, often taking hours to work. Enough time, in fact, for a man to leave the inn, return to the village, and be seen if not alive, then at least mobile. Which meant one of two things: either Draycott had not poisoned him with digitoxin at all, or someone else had administered it earlier. Miss Marple frowned. She recalled Eliza Willett saying Harold had seemed pale and sweaty after visiting the Burling house, that he had looked unwell before he ever reached the Crown Inn. A quiet suspicion, long buried beneath the larger crisis, now stirred in her thought. She rose from the bench and made her way toward the allotments. Eliza was there as usual, fussing over a reluctant cucumber plant and scolding the goat, which appeared indifferent to everything except its own feed. She greeted Miss Marple cheerfully, as though she hadn't recently been part of a murder investigation's periphery. "Eliza," said Miss Marple, "I wanted to ask you something if I may." "Of course, miss," she said brightly. "Is it about the garden show? I've still got your rosettes here." No, said Miss Marple. "It's about tea, more specifically, the tea you served Harold Tapping when he came to sort through Mrs. Burling's belongings." Eliza blinked. "Tea? Why yes, I made him some. He asked for it. Said he had a headache." "And what sort of tea did you make?" "Oh, I didn't make it," she said. "He made it himself. Brought a little sachet with him. Said it helped with nerves. Bitter stuff too. Smelled odd." Miss Marple's breath caught. "Did he offer you any?" "Oh no. Just made a single cup, drank it while reading papers. Looked right ill afterward. That was it." Miss Marple thanked Eliza, and returned to her cottage at once. The implication was now clear. Harold had already ingested the poison before he ever reached the Crown Inn. Draycott had moved the body. Yes. Disguised himself. Yes. But he had not administered the fatal dose. Someone else had. She reached for the telephone. "Inspector Cray," she said. "I'm afraid I've led you only part way to the truth. Draycott moved the body, but he did not commit the murder." There was a pause on the line. "Then who did?" Miss Marple looked toward the distant path that led out of town, toward the old Burling estate, and its heir. "It was Esther Burling," she said. "Explain." "She knew about the letter. She burned them, yes, but too late. Harold had already read them, and I believe he told her before he left that he intended to confront someone about them. He likely even mentioned the tea sachet, his own blend for nerves. She would have had the perfect opportunity to lace it with digitox. She had the knowledge her aunt's garden was full of foxglove, and the motive, not greed, but fear. She feared the estate would be taken from her. She feared the village. Miss Marple said, "It's judgment. It's cruel to Esther. has lived a lifetime beneath the weight of whispered opinions, illegitimacy, scandal, public shame. She knew what it would mean if Peter Wilmot's existence was proven. She panicked, and she struck first. And Draycott, he arrived later, found Harold dead or dying, assumed the worst, and took advantage of the situation, moved the body, staged the scene, and tried to buy time. Two guilty parties, Cray murmured. Neither innocent, said Miss Marple, but neither fully wicked, just human, terribly, painfully human. There was silence for a moment. Then Cray said, I'll arrange to bring her in, quietly. Miss Marple hung up the phone and sat back in her chair. The village around her glowed in the late afternoon sun, as if untouched by the truth it now carried. But she knew better. Sometimes the past doesn't come back in a thunderclap. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a cup of tea. By the following morning the peaceful rhythms of Little Witham had resumed their slow, familiar cadence, though they pulsed now with something unspoken like the echo of a bell long stopped. A second arrest in as many weeks had not yet reached the headlines, thanks to Inspector Cray's measured discretion. But the village already knew, villages always knew, Esther Burling had been taken from her home at dawn, not in handcuffs but in quiet company. No sirens, no drama, just two officers in plain coats and a brief conversation that ended with Esther collecting her coat, standing at her garden gate, and walking between them like someone heading into weather she'd known was coming. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window, lace curtain drawn just far enough to watch without being noticed. She did not smile, nor sigh, nor frown. She merely watched, her face unreadable as Esther disappeared down the lane. She had expected it to feel like resolution, but it did. Later that morning Inspector Cray arrived again, appearing at Miss Marple's door with something like weariness in his eyes. She let him in without a word, and offered tea which he accepted but didn't drink. She confessed, he said finally. Did she? Cray gave a short nod. Once we presented the details, Harold's tea, the digitoxin, her knowledge of its effect, she said she'd been frightened. Said Harold told her he'd spoken with someone claiming to be Peter Wilmot, that everything was going to come out. She acted to preserve her reputation, Miss Marple said softly. As I thought. Cray gave a hollow chuckle. You really did think of everything, didn't you? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I listen, Inspector. People explain themselves long before they realize they're doing it. Cray leaned forward. I have to ask. Did you know she was guilty from the beginning? No, Miss Marple said. Not from the beginning. I thought it might have been her, but I believed Draycott's guilt was sufficient until the facts about the poison made it clear. He moved the body, but she killed the man. Cray exhaled. It's not going to go well for her. I imagine not, but I hope they'll be merciful. He sipped the tea. Finally, there's something you said yesterday about people being terribly human. It stayed with me. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. Good. It should. Cray rose soon after, and left, his departure as quiet as his arrival. He had begun to understand that Little Witham was not a place for loud conclusions. With him gone, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The climbing roses were thriving now, reaching in pink and red bursts along the trellis. Unaware of the drama they had witnessed over the past day, she pruned a few dead blooms with careful hands, her mind ticking over the many layers of deception that had unfolded here, layers not just of criminal intent, but of sorrow, of silence, of the aching burden of secrets long held. Because that, she reflected, was what truly haunted Little Witham. Not murder, not even scandal, but the aching knowledge that one woman's fear of shame had led her to murder, and another's shame had led him to impersonation and concealment, each believing in their own way that it was better to lie and to kill than to be judged. She thought of Peter Wilmot, the real one, dead now for decades, a man whose name had become currency for lies. And she thought too of Harold Tapp, a dull, methodical man perhaps, but one who had tried in the end to do something right, who had believed that the truth, even buried under years and silence, was worth unearthing. She found herself sitting on her garden bench, eyes closed, face tilted to the light. A gentle breeze rustled the hollyhocks, and from somewhere near the vicarage, she heard the faint, familiar clatter of a bicycle, the post arriving late. Then came footsteps. She opened her eyes to find Michael Lawton standing by her gate. He looked nervous, hands deep in his pockets again, but this time he stepped forward without prompting. Miss Marple, he said,
"Can I talk to you?" "Of course, Michael. Sit down." He did, awkwardly perching on the very edge of the bench like a schoolboy before a headmistress. I wanted to thank you for not saying more than you had to, about me, about what I did." "You carried a bundle," Miss Marple said. "You did not know what was in it. You saw something confusing and frightening and kept quiet. That isn't crime, Michael. That's simply being young." He looked at the ground. "It doesn't feel that way." "No," she said gently. "It rarely does." He shifted. "Do you think I should leave? Go somewhere else?" "That depends. Do you intend to learn from this?" He nodded. "Yeah, I think I already have." "Then stay," Miss Marple said. "There's no shame in having seen a truth too difficult to speak aloud. The shame lies only in ignoring it when it arrives." Michael was quiet a long time. When he finally stood to leave, he looked tall, or perhaps he simply stood straighter, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew long across the gravel paths. Miss Marple finished her tea and returned inside. She took her notebook from its usual place, slipped it into the drawer, and closed it with finality. The case of the man who died twice had finally found its ending. But in the tidy village of Little Witham, endings were always followed by something else, an adjustment, a reckoning, and eventually, quietly, the resumption of life.
Neatly trimmed hedges and the orderly garden where Miss Marple was already seated with a small pot of tea and a stack of linen napkins. He allowed himself a respectful nod. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "You sounded rather certain on the telephone." "I am, Inspector," she replied calmly. "More certain than I like to be. In matters of this sort." Cray sat without waiting for an invitation, brushing imaginary dust from his coat. "You said you've identified the murderer. Do you mind starting at the beginning?" Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea without comment, and began. "Let us suppose," she said, "that someone wished to remove Harold Tapping, not simply out of hatred or opportunism, but as part of a carefully timed deception, the purpose of which I believe was not merely murder, but the acquisition or perhaps protection of certain documents Harold carried. Specifically," Cray said, "the proof of Peter Wilmot's existence." "Exactly," Miss Marple nodded. "Harold Tapping had evidence. Letters, a birth certificate, proving that Peter Wilmot was Millicent Burling's son. If substantiated, that claim would have disrupted the inheritance Esther Burling now possesses. But the question isn't whether Peter was real. The question is, who knew about him, and who had the most to lose if the truth came out?" Cray looked grim. "Esther Burling, she would seem the obvious suspect." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but I visited her, and I'm quite convinced she knew very little until after Harold's death. She burned the letters out of fear, not guilt. She is a practical woman, not a clever one, and whoever murdered Mr. Tapping had to be clever, very clever." She paused, letting the words settle. "The impersonation," she continued, "was the first real clue. Several witnesses, including Mrs. Reeves and Miss Goff, swore they saw Harold Tapping after he was likely already dead. That requires not only boldness but a good understanding of his habits, his gait, even his clothing." Cray furrowed his brow. "We confirmed he stayed at the inn in Bracknell the night before the garden show." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "and he had a visitor, someone who claimed to be Peter Wilmot. Harold must have been suspicious. He left that note with Reverend Draycott after all, but he agreed to. I believe he was murdered either during or just after that meeting." Cray leaned forward. "And who was the imposter?" "That, Inspector, is the heart of it," she said softly. "And the answer, I'm afraid, lies with Michael Lawton." Cray's eyes narrowed. "The estate agent's assistant. We've questioned him twice. I imagine he told you very little, but what he did not say was more revealing. He was at the garden show, despite claiming otherwise. I found his boot prints myself, near the and I believe he saw someone he recognized, dragging Mr. Tapping's body into the tool shed." "You think he witnessed the murder?" "No, but he saw enough to know that Mr. Tapping had not fallen. The angle of the body, the marks on the grass, even the stool, it was staged, and Michael, poor boy, has been terrified ever since." Cray was frowning now, deeply. "But that still doesn't make him the killer." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "He isn't, but he may have helped without knowing. Or worse, being tricked into helping by someone he trusted. Cray blinked. Who would that be? Miss Marple reached into the pocket of her cardigan and drew out a photograph, a copy of a much older one, clearly aged and grainy, but unmistakable. Two young men, no older than 20, stood beside one another, one with an arm slung around the other's shoulders. On the back, in faded pen, PW&HT, Manchester. I found this in Harold Tapping's briefcase, she said. He kept it. All these years. Cray took the photograph and studied it. That's Tapping on the right, but the other man is the real Peter Wilmot. Cray looked up. How do you know? Because I remember him, Miss Marple said simply. He worked for a summer in St. Mary Mead in the late 30s. A kind boy. He died in the war, killed in Italy, which means whoever claimed to be Peter Wilmot in Bracknell the night before the murder was an imposter. Cray sat back slowly. So who posed as Peter, and who impersonated Tapping after his death? Miss Marple's eyes held his, the same, someone who knew Tapping well enough to mimic his habits, someone close enough to learn about the letters, to understand the inheritance implications, someone with legal knowledge and access. There was a long pause. Cray exhaled. Reverend Draycott. Miss Marple gave a faint nod. Yeah, a vicar, but once a solicitor. He left the legal profession in 1940, after some scandal involving forged documents. Difficult to trace, but it's there if you look. He came to Little Witham shortly after, where he's been ever since. But why? Because he was Peter Wilmot's half-brother, unacknowledged, born of the same father, different mother. He never stood to inherit, but he always resented that Peter was meant to be the legitimate heir, Millicent Burling's chosen successor. When Peter died in the war, Draycott assumed the truth would be buried, and it was for a time. But then Harold Tapping began to poke into it again. The letters resurfaced, and Reverend Draycott did what he had once done before. He forged an identity. Cray was silent, watching her. Miss Marple continued gently. He posed as Peter Wilmot, knowing Harold would be cautious. He murdered him, likely with poison, and transported the body to the shed early the next morning. He then donned Tapping's clothes and made a brief appearance, just enough to be seen by Mrs. Reeves and Miss Goffer. It bought him several hours' grace before the body was discovered. Cray's voice was quiet now. And Michael Larton helped him, unwittingly. The vicar asked him to carry something early that morning, a bundle perhaps wrapped in a coat. Michael, loyal and unsuspecting, obliged, but he knew something was wrong when he heard later that Harold had been found dead in the shed, and the briefcase. Draycott couldn't destroy the documents too quickly. That would arouse suspicion. So he hid the briefcase, intending to retrieve it later. He hadn't counted on curious children. Cray stood slowly, placing the photograph down with care. We'll bring him in, he said. We'll start gently, and we'll have Michael Larton in as a witness. I don't think he'll keep quiet after this. Miss Marple looked toward the garden gate, where the morning sunlight fell softly across her neat beds of pansies and marigolds. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It's always the same, Inspector. Pride, resentment, inheritance. People think themselves exceptional, but in the end it's just human nature. Cray gave her a long look. You're right, Miss Marple, but even knowing that, I still don't know how you see it so clearly. She smiled faintly. Because, Inspector, people rarely and after 80 years of observing them, I don't really need to see, I just need to listen. And as the inspector left her in the golden stillness of the morning, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, counting her stitches with the same quiet precision she had applied to solving murder. 1, 2, 3, a life unraveled, and a mystery at last, coming to rest. It was nearly midday by the time Inspector Cray returned to the vicarage with 2 plainclothes officers and a quiet determination. The garden gate creaked politely, as if it too were reluctant to disturb the serenity of Reverend Ambrose Draycott's carefully cultivated world. The vicar was in his study, just finishing a sermon draft titled Mercy and Memory, The Quiet Gifts. When the knock came, he opened the door with his usual calm expression, perhaps only slightly more guarded than usual. Inspector, he said pleasantly, back again. I hope this isn't about poor Michael Larton. I was just preparing to speak with him this evening. The boy's troubled. Cray returned the smile without warmth. That won't be necessary, Reverend.
We've already spoken with Michael, and we'd like to speak with you now. Inside, please. There was a slight pause, a hesitation almost too faint to catch, but Miss Marple, watching from her discreet perch across the green behind the shade of her lilac bush, saw it clearly. The moment before the mask slipped, the calculation, the cost of resistance measured and dismissed, and then, just like that, the clergyman smiled and stepped aside. Of course, come in, gentlemen. The interview began in the vicarage study, beneath the gaze of ancestral clergy in oil portraits, and a silver-framed photograph of the late Millicent Burling, whose stern expression now bore an ironic weight. Draycott sat with his fingers laced together, expression neutral, his answers clipped and polite. Cray led with formality. We recovered a letter written by Harold Tapping, naming you as the person he intended to meet the night before his death. He identified his companion as someone claiming to be Peter Wilmot. That, I'm afraid, points us in your direction. Draycott offered a faint smile. It points only to Harold's fear. If I'd been pretending to be this Peter Wilmot, wouldn't that make me the one with the most to gain by his silence? And yet here I am, cooperating. Cray's tone was steady. We also have a photograph taken in 1931, of Harold Tapping and the real Peter Wilmot. The man you impersonated is dead. You must have known that. The vicar's jaw tensed. I knew Harold in his youth. We met again decades later, entirely by chance. I confess we shared some unfortunate history, but I did not kill him. Cray leaned forward. You forged an identity. You disguised yourself as Tapping the morning after his death, to make it appear he was still alive. We have witness accounts placing him outside the post office, and yet he'd already been dead for hours. You are one of the few men in the village of similar build. You had his schedule. Draycott's voice sharpened, though only slightly. Those are clever deductions, but not evidence. It might have continued that way, graceful verbal fencing, logic against logic, had Michael Lawton not chosen that moment to enter the room, accompanied by four. Michael looked pale but composed. He carried himself differently than he had 2 days ago, less like a frightened boy, more like a man trying to reclaim his footing after a long, confusing fall. Draycott's head turned, and for a fraction of a second, his composure. Michael, he said, I told you not to worry about this business. The young man swallowed. You told me to carry a bundle to the shed. You said it was church books you needed stored away. You never said anything about Harold Tapping. Cray held up a hand. Just tell us what you saw, Michael. Michael's voice was quiet but clear. I came back around the garden later, and I saw him, Mr. Tapping, lying on the floor of the shed. I thought he'd fallen, but then I saw Reverend Draycott with the briefcase, wiping it with a cloth. He looked up and saw me. He said Harold had taken a fall, that he was trying to get him help, but he wasn't. He was hiding him. Cray turned back to the vicar. Well, Reverend, there was silence. Then slowly, deliberately, Reverend Draycott stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the village green, where Miss Marple, now openly watching from the edge of her garden, stood with her hands resting gently on the fence rail. When he spoke again, his voice was different, no longer clipped or defense. There was a strange, weary release in it. Yes, I killed him, he said. Cray stiffened. Draycott went on. It was never meant to happen that way. Harold and I, yes, we had our history. Decades ago we were young, reckless. I was not always a clergyman. I was once ambitious. Harold had evidence of Peter Wilmot's birth. I knew that. He wouldn't let it rest. He thought he was protecting something noble, but he didn't understand what it would do. It would ruin Esther. And yes, I resented that Peter had always been the son Millicent favored. Even in death, his shadow lived on. He turned, expression almost tranquil. I met Harold at the Crown Inn. I told him I was Peter, that I'd come to claim my rightful inheritance. I thought I could bluff my way into getting the documents and vanishing, but he didn't believe me. He confronted me, threatened to expose everything, said he'd already written to the vicar here with instructions. So he exhaled. I added a few drops of digitoxin to his tea. That was all. Quick, clean. He never knew. I took his case and returned here before dawn. I had to make it seem as if he was still alive. I wore his coat, his hat. I made sure the right people saw me, and then I staged the fall in the shed. I never thought the boy would notice. Cray stood. That's enough, Reverend. Draycott raised his hands gently. You have my confession. There's nothing more to say, but there was, and it was Miss Marple who said it later that afternoon, as she sat once more across from Cray, who now looked slightly older, slightly grayer. I always find, she said, that the most dangerous people are not the ones who rage or shout, but the ones who believe they're justified. Reverend Draycott thought himself a guardian, but what he really protected was his own pride. Cray nodded slowly. If you hadn't pressed Michael, hadn't gone back through the history. People leave trails, Miss Marple said gently, not just in letters or footprints, but in the choices they make, the things they hide, the lies they tell themselves before they ever tell them to others. He looked at her with unguarded admiration. And you see all of it? No, she said, but I've learned to listen. Most people tell you what you need to know, if you let them talk long enough. From the churchyard, the bells rang the hour. Somewhere in the village, someone hung out washing. Children's laughter floated faintly across the green, the sound of innocence returning. Cray rose. There'll be a trial, likely a resignation before that, and a good deal of press. Little Witham will survive, Miss Marple said with quiet certainty. It always does. And she returned to her garden, where the lavender was beginning to bloom, and a new tray of seedlings waited to be planted. She picked up her trowel, wiped her gloves clean, and began to dig, because in villages like Little Witham, life always found a way to grow again, even after deceit, even after the man who died twice was finally buried, only once. It was a cautious breath, to be sure, like the kind one takes after waking from a particularly vivid nightmare, but it was breath nonetheless. The village resumed its rhythm with tentative grace. The baker's bell jingled again in the morning. The butcher's chalkboard returned to its usual battle between pork belly and cutlets, and the postmistress began complaining about the rising cost of brown paper with something approaching normalcy. And yet there remained an undeniable tension in the air, like a painting hung slightly askew. The fact that the village's spiritual leader had, for more than a decade, quietly carried a forged identity and murdered a man to protect it, well, that sort of thing wasn't easily absorbed, even in a place where gossip was more durable than stone. Miss Marple, of course, took none of this disruption for granted. She had long since learned that when order is restored too quickly, it often conceals the parts left unresolved, and there was still one piece, just one, that had not settled properly in her mind. She thought of it on the morning she visited Esther Burling again. The garden at Rosewood Cottage had suffered during the storm of public attention. The camellia bush was wind-blown, and the nasturtiums hung limp, though still defiantly bright. Miss Marple rang the bell just as the clock struck 10. Esther answered, composed as ever, though her expression bore the faint hollowness of someone who had, only recently, learned her entire family history, had been both smaller and stranger than she'd been raised to believe. Miss Marple, she said with a weary smile, I imagine you want to talk. If you have the strength for it, Miss Marple said gently. They took tea inside, thin china cups, with weak Earl Grey and a plate of biscuits, that looked bought rather than baked. Esther was quiet for some time, watching the steam curl from her cup before she finally spoke. Was it all true, she asked, about Draycott? Yes, said Miss Marple, it was. Esther nodded slowly. It's strange, you know, I never liked him, and I always felt guilty about that, but he always had that way of looking at you like he already knew your sins. Some people wear the cloth to keep others honest, said Miss Marple, and some wear it to hide themselves. Esther looked it down. What happens to everything now? The estate, the house, if Peter Wilmot is dead, if Peter Wilmot is dead, if Peter Wilmot.
The Garden Society resumed its meetings by the following Thursday, hosted by Miss Lavinia Blake, who insisted on stricter entrance criteria for sponge cakes and fewer roses of indeterminate pedigree. Mrs. Reeves had already returned to her usual gossip with a fresh arsenal of "well, I always suspected" comments. Reverend Draycott's pulpit was now empty. The Church of England had sent word that an interim vicar would arrive in a fortnight. Until then, the church would be led by a retired canon from Oxford, who played hymns with too much enthusiasm and pronounced evensong with 3 syllables. The village didn't seem to mind, and as for Miss Marple, she returned to her knitting, her garden and her endless cups of weak tea. She offered no speeches, no lectures, no grand reflections on guilt or morality. She smiled gently when thanked and politely when questioned. She never once repeated the phrase she had said to Inspector Cray, but she thought it once, while planting a fresh row of sweet pea. People rarely change, but they often hide, and in Little Witham, as in so many villages across England, there would always be secrets growing just beneath the soil waiting for rain or time or tragedy to bring them up into the light. A soft drizzle fell on Little Witham the morning of Harold Tapping's funeral. The rain came down in that gentle, unobtrusive way so particular to English villages, more like a curtain than a storm, settling quietly on the gravestones and hedgerows, and soaking into the earth without fuss. Despite the weather, the funeral was well attended. Respectability, after all, demanded it. Tapping had not been beloved, but he had been known, and being known, particularly in a village such as this, meant being watched in death as carefully as one was in life. Miss Marple arrived precisely 5 minutes early, dressed in dark grey with a modest black hat, and carrying a folded umbrella that had seen countless services before this one. She took a seat midway down the left-hand side of Mildred's, nodding gently to the familiar faces that greeted her with subdued glances and murmured condolences, as though she and not the man in the casket had suffered the greater loss. To some extent perhaps she had. For Miss Marple, every murder left a subtle bruise. She carried each one with her quietly, like pages in a private ledger. Not from guilt, nor even from sorrow exactly, but from the sobering knowledge that evil, when it chose to appear, often wore the face of the familiar. At the front of the church, the temporary canon read the appropriate verses in a surprisingly theatrical baritone. Psalms echoed from the stone arches. Raindrops traced wandering paths down the stained-glass windows. Esther Burling, of course, was not in attendance. She remained in custody at Bracknell, awaiting trial. Her solicitor had issued a statement on her behalf, grief-stricken, confused, unintended consequences. There was talk already of diminished responsibility and psychological pressure. Miss Marple had no doubt that her punishment would be measured and complicated. Reverend Draycott had also been absent for some time now, his resignation accepted quietly by the church, his future uncertain. Whether he would face formal charges or fade into ecclesiastical obscurity remained to be seen. The law had yet to decide how best to handle a clergyman who had committed no murder but had committed nearly everything else. The casket, simple and unadorned, was lowered into the ground at the far end of the churchyard, near the western wall. Miss Marple watched as the first spadful of earth fell with a soft final thud. She wondered briefly, who would remember Harold Tapping in 5 years? Perhaps no one. Perhaps only in hushed retellings at garden parties and over gate fences. Do you remember that odd little solicitor who was killed? The one who died twice, they said. Miss Marple left the churchyard without lingering, nodding to the few who offered her brief, knowing look. She walked back through the village with measured steps, the rain misting her coat and leaving speckled prints on the grey stone paths. There was something cleansing about it, she thought, as though the very village had exhaled. She had nearly reached her cottage when she heard the voice behind her. Miss Marple, she turned to see Michael Lawton approaching, his overcoat too large and one trouser cuff damp from a puddle. He looked older than his 21 years today, but steadier, a little like a tree that had survived its first storm. "I'm sorry to catch you," he said, "but I wondered if I might ask a question." "Of course," she said. "Walk with me." They strolled slowly past the allotments, where the soil had grown rich and dark with recent rain. The goat bleated once in mild protest at the weather, then returned to its chewing. "I still don't understand why she did it," Michael said at last. "Miss Burling, I mean, she had everything. The house, the money. Why risk it all?" Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "Because, Michael, in a village like ours, reputation is everything. Money buys comfort, but reputation buys peace." Michael looked down. "So she killed to keep people from talking." "Not only talking," Miss Marple said. "Judge, she'd lived her life hearing the whispers about her plainness, her lack of prospects, her reliance on her aunt's charity. When she finally had something of her own, she couldn't bear the thought of it being snatched away, especially not by a man who'd once called her a weak branch on a fine tree." Michael blinked. "Tapping said that?" Miss Marple's mouth tightened. "In a letter, one of the ones she burned, but I saw it, and I think it stayed with her." They walked in silence for a few steps more. "Do you think she's evil?" he asked. Miss Marple paused. "No, I think she's human. Flawed, frightened, dangerous, in a particular kind of way. But not evil." Michael nodded slowly. "I've decided to leave the estate office. I want to start somewhere new. I don't want to be remembered for what I saw and didn't say." "A wise choice," Miss Marple said.
But do remember, Michael, what you did say helped bring the truth to light. It's never too late to speak when it matters." He gave her a grateful look, then turned and disappeared down the lane toward the post office. Miss Marple continued home. At the gate to her cottage, she paused and looked out across the green. The bunting from the ill-fated garden show had long since been taken down, but she could still see its ghost fluttering in her memory. She thought of the sequence again, step by step: the garden show, the scream, the shed, Harold's broken body, the mismatched times, the tea, the letter, the impersonation, the birth certificate tucked away like a secret apology. She had seen murders in many forms, crimes of passion, of greed, of madness, but this one had been quiet, almost sad. A death not born of hate, but of desperation, of someone who could not imagine another path. And perhaps, she thought, that was the most tragic crime of all, a failure of imagination, a life so small, so carefully caged by fear, that murder seemed the only escape. Inside her sitting room, Miss Marple set down her gloves, removed her hat and lit the gas fire. She took out her knitting, the same pale blue shawl she'd been working on before the murder, and resumed her stitches. 1, 2, 3, a click of the needles, a breath, a memory. She would never forget Harold tapping, nor Esther Burling, nor Reverend Draycott. She would remember them all, quietly, with the solemn dignity they had denied themselves. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sun emerged weakly, timid after days of hiding, and lit the leaves with a gentle sheen. Life in Little Witham would go on, as it always did, and Miss Marple, ever gentle, ever watching, would be there when it faltered again, because it always did, eventually. The weeks that followed passed with a sense of cautious renewal. Little Witham, like a frost-bitten garden in spring, emerged slowly from the shadow of scandal. Talk of the murder lessened, not because it was forgotten, but because the village in its own way had absorbed the pain. People spoke of Esther Burling now, with a quiet melancholy, and of Reverend Draycott with something resembling pity. Both remained in their respective exiles, and while justice would take its course, the sharper edges of judgment had already dulled. Michael Larton left the village a fortnight later, bound for Dorset, and a modest job at a surveying firm. He came to say goodbye to Miss Marple, bringing her a small tin of toffee and a nervous promise to write if you'd like. She accepted both with her usual kindness, and no mention of the fact that she had already written him a reference. It was not until late April that the final piece of the mystery presented itself, not with fanfare, but quietly, as such things often do. A brown envelope arrived by post, addressed to Miss Jane Marple in tidy, precise handwriting. There was no return address. Inside, she found a single letter, unsigned, but she recognized the penmanship at once. The letter was from Harold Tapping. "Miss Marple, if you are reading this, I expect I have not survived what I set out to do. Forgive me the melodrama. I always preferred clarity over drama, but I had hoped to put an end to the quiet blackmail that has shadowed this village for too long. I discovered the truth about Peter Wilmot by accident." Esther's aunt left more behind than she realized. Old letters, and a lock of hair marked P.W. I knew exposing this would hurt Esther. She has suffered already, but silence is its own cruelty. I hoped that by naming the truth, and putting the records in the hands of someone who could judge wisely, the matter could be handled with dignity. I leave them with you. You understand people better than I ever did. Yours sincerely, H.T. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then a third time. Then she placed it carefully into a folder along with the birth certificate and the final draft of the codicil Harold had prepared. It had arrived too late to help him, but not too late to do what he had intended. Later that day, she visited the churchyard once more. Harold's grave, now marked with a modest headstone, sat in the soft shade of a yew tree. Someone, perhaps Eliza, perhaps someone else entirely, had placed a small bundle of violets there. Miss Marple stood for a time, gloved hands folded in front of her. "You did try," she said, quiet, "in your way." The wind stirred the branches above, and in the hush that followed, it was easy to imagine the village at peace again. Not because it was without secrets, no village ever truly was, but because the truth had at last been acknowledged. When she returned home, she penned a letter to Harold's remaining colleague at the Market Lorimer firm, enclosing the original documents, along with the signed codicil. His last intentions, she wrote, should be honored. She did not speak of it again. That evening, As twilight settled over the garden and the scent of cut grass and tulips drifted in through the open window, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, now nearly finished. A soft knock came at the door. It was Miss Reeves with a plate of lemon biscuits and an excuse about needing someone to test a new recipe. Miss Marple invited her in, and they sat together, speaking of unimportant things, the weather, the price of seed packets, the troublesome new hymnal, and as they talked, the village around them carried on, small and flawed and very much alive. The rain had passed, the lilacs were blooming, and beneath it all the quiet assurance that justice, true justice, not the loud kind, had been done. Miss Marple took another stitch, then another. 1, 2, 3. Evil had visited Little Witham, but so had truth, and she would be ready when it came again.